This is not Mozart, but it is Mozart. Hello. Very often when one wanders beyond one's mind on specific things one does, these digressions are healthy, even if they're not necessarily to be presented. And more specifically so in music, going further in the piece one loves to play and sometimes dreads to practice. That's human nature. To be patient while also resilient and fight beyond the construction of sandcastles in order to every day, every evening, every hour restart from scratch. Now the difference with playing the notes of a score, like a recitant, even if as an actor you have to be believed therefore that those are your own words because you tell them in the real time, be it old words, dead person's words, or eternal words in their universal meaning, they still are incarnated, vehicled by the person who tells them, and in this case plays them. And so many times people, I think, wrongly assume that copying a style is just some kind of skill, which it is in the beginning, because you capture, like you learn the foreign language specific accent so that you don't sound foreign when you speak it. Same thing in music. You have to be as believable today in the 21st century of playing music for past centuries, when in the past centuries they barely played but their own time's music. So we are in a way the most privileged in musical history because we have the most access to ancient scores and therefore we can speak about style, interpretation, and possibly also varying interpretations through a life of a performer with evolution of the understanding of the meaning of things. So it's a luxury for us to live long in comparison to past centuries. Therefore, it's also a privilege to know so much more than they knew about their own past. Perhaps they would have wished to, I'm sure. But in a way, the urgency was to create and live until knowingly, well, because all lives are fragile by essence. But in this hairpin that represents life within the two endings, the beginning and the ending, we become to be attracted artistically, intellectually, emotionally, affectionately with others, people, causes, animals, art, some forms of art, some forms of humanity, of humankind that represent us in the different contradictory aspects of ours. And I find that it's very reductive to say, for instance, if I play as I just started, that this is obviously Mozart from the Concerto K453. So in the 18th century, many people composed tonal, and many might have played the third down and up and add a more trill or an ornament to bring it to bridge to the next note. Now, it's recognizable as a leitmotif. Therefore, plagiarism becomes the only way to quote any of the musicologists who analyze the stylistic specificities of a composer and then finding some kind of echo or willing imitation of that style on the surface. For instance, with the trill and the ascending third, and using G major, which is the same tonality as Mozart's concerto for those who know it, and therefore immediately it sounds familiar. Except that if you continue and you dwell through and beyond the few notes that were written down by Mozart, and instead of playing his score, you take this as the departure of your own imaginary path through this garden, if you want for another image, perhaps through this inner world of Mozart's Concerto 453. And so with skill you can make it into anything beyond what he wrote. It's sort of like living a bit longer in the musical world of a beloved piece, beyond the composer. But of course then you're not the composer, so you cannot second guess what he or she would have done had they lived longer to continue it differently, or perhaps imagine how by aging a composer who died young would have developed from what we know to the development of the character, which is the same in fact since birth, but evolves with the influences of the time. And some fight their time, like late romantics like Brahms, Rachmaninoff, by remaining true to themselves beyond the time frame where others have started already atonalism and other forms. And they didn't need to. Mademoiselle Boulanger used to tell me that composers who didn't need to question the language which they received from their peers or from their mentors is because they expressed themselves for the meaning that they had to extract from themselves, which becomes today's an evidence to us, like a Schubert song, sonata, line, melodic, repeated notes like in singing. So it's evident that Schubert didn't need to find atonalism to express what he had to say. It wasn't that he was lazy or that he was less curious. I think perhaps he was formatted, but so are we all. And so it's difficult to think outside of the box, as they say, and be in the box, therefore inside the mindset. And some composers like Schubert throw evidence at us, a melodic line, and we go, oh, unforgettable. And then the way it's quoted, dressed, harmonized, decorated, and all that, brings us to define the style. So we can sort of imitate with knowledge, skill, with toolbox, the surface of things, what reminds us of somebody, just like when you visit the parents of a newborn baby, everybody in the family tries to define to whom this baby looks. And it's the eye of the beholder, and in this case the ear of the beholder, when you can find something that seems to be the same, but then instead of going where Schubert wrote it, you can go, it's simple as just continuing a little further in another way, then you can modulate. Actually, it is sounding immediately to us who know the path Schubert took and the choice he did in composing, not improvising, therefore organizing and choosing how he develops the melodic line, what comes after the first thought, the second, the third, the phrases, how the whole structure unveils. I think it's very healthy. As a matter of fact, I advise it if a student can try to explore with their own means, depending how much or keyboard harmony or contrapoint or in other words, how much grammar they have, to write their own essay or novel or poem, even if it's inspired. And that is the problem with imitation, inspiration being sometimes very tenuous border in between the two. But it reminds us immediately of somebody. Would it be the baby's face, or a melodic line, or a leitmotif? And there's always something that comes after that in Rachmaninoff's 39.5. And we know which one it is because it's written. artistically is obviously considered by many purists as loss of time, unimportant dwelling, and in any case, imitation, therefore belittled. Therefore, I mean, obviously, I don't advocate imitation as a form of creation, but in many cases, not only one obviously, many cases, one can find reminiscence of other things in everything. Therefore, one should accept that between serendipity or perhaps willing imitation or using it as the departure of one's own inspiration, but that's the follow-up after the first line, first melody, first phrase that makes the piece so meaningful to us beyond the catchy opening. Obviously, if he had done, we would have said, oh, he wouldn't have done it 3 times, but if he did, would say, oh, it's great, he did it. And when we see he did, so we think, okay, perhaps he could have done nothing but the reversing, inverting, or completely modulating, but that he didn't do at all, at least not in that way. So there is a very interesting fact that when you play or live or bathe, therefore, so to say, in a certain style of music which you perform, I think you should be allowed to do what I demonstrate now, which is very healthy, to explore a little bit around the garden. And of course, as I said earlier, unfortunately, the first few steps out of the original composer's decided steps, even within the same musical, stylistic, atmospheric time perception and believable imitation, that it might be an original, even if it's a copy, I think the inevitable is to say, oh, it's banal, he would have never done that. And who am I anyway to know? Because I'm here just to recite and serve the piece at the best I can. I remember Mademoiselle Boulanger telling me when I was coming up with some creative fingerings for the creative voicings or creative cadences or creative, as if customizing the piece that you're playing and not totally agreeing with the way the composer chose to treat some details, even if it is only. And of course, you can do creative voicings. Like in Brahms 118 number 2. And imagine the continuation of the secondary voice, which he stops in the middle here. And do. Add a stem to a secondary continuation of a voice that you wish he did because you love it so much that you love it probably more than he did, because you receive it and you feel, oh my God, when you feel so loving the piece, you want to be in the piece all the time. It's like you want to be with somebody you love, you want to be in a place that you love because somehow the sunset, the place, the food, the wind, the smell, the atmosphere means to you so much that you want to be there. You can call it paradise in dreams or reality of going somewhere where you feel that connection with the make one with the nature, for instance. I think the same thing here, this imaginary universe of a given composer like the Ravel Sonatine, with all the due respect, could have gone, sorry, and so you can say, well, in that case, anything is in anything, everything is allowed, therefore it's anarchy. And anarchy is a form also of freeing oneself from some strong held rules and upheld rules. the point of the rules is to free yourself from them by learning the point for which they were invented, which made you progress to a certain direction. So it's like ties that free you from being tied up, if I may use this analogy too. I use all the time analogies, but it's because my brain constantly thinks only in images and not in abstract enough at all, as I was often told by my own dad. But be it so, my imagination musically is not to, today I want to say that it's not to copy, it's not to take it as a point of departure and then go out of it, as well as atonal and then start like... Obviously, it seems like something broke down. But if you continue in a tonal system with the harmonic, melodic explanation of the details we see on the score, you have diminished seventh chords, repeated pounding chords, the melodic line in minor, modulation, and then the return through secondary dominant. Dialogue of two voices. Or the Mozart. Trying to stay inside it by using the same tools. Alberti basses Mozart in the left hand and trills with ascending thirds, perhaps gentle modulations, and using delay tactics as the deceptive cadences. And return in G major, or never leave it. Does it mean that being able or allowing oneself to explore such digressions is loss of time? Or is it also loss of time to acquire the recitation of the details of the composer's wish to the score? Difficult to know. As a teacher, I cannot encourage students to disrespect the piece, which purists would consider this kind of demonstration is. On the other hand, I think since most of the performers are no more composers like until the mid-20th century, for the latest examples, the Rachmaninoffs, the Mettners, well, then the performers who opt out of composing, either because they don't consider themselves at the level, because they practice pieces that are so incredibly masterpieceful, then they say, who am I to try? Or attempting to enjoy that the strict interpretation, meaning without changing voicings, notes, tempi, without, of course, adding extra notes in the sense of extra sections, perhaps like cadenza bursts in the middle of a piece, then I think that as a teacher I can say I encourage, but I don't want there to become aware that their interpretation, which by essence means translation, is their compositional input within the piece. Though it's true that spacing two words can change the meaning of a monologue in a different way, in a different spot, there is always room between the notes as well, within the interpretation, to create an oeuvre, which is the interpretation, on top of the piece, which is the piece, and on top of which you can add perhaps these extra things that you feel the composer, for various reasons of your opinion, didn't go far enough, or hinted without to give a clue how to. For instance, when Beethoven writes at the end of the Les Adieux, a whole note crescendo to B flat, I personally think, even if it's an intention to imitate a string instrument that can, with vibrato, with a, create a sense of bridge with a lengthening of the sound, but on the high note, I would do, making this vocalise of sort, that is acceptable, of course, within the style of bel canto singing, but of course not in a Beethoven sonata, which is texted since World War II so many times that everybody is afraid to do anything wrong, let less allow themselves, even in good faith, even in good intention, to push it a little bit further in order to say, well, I want to do something with this held note because I cannot crescendo on a held note, which Beethoven knew anyway. So beyond playing it with intention or having the body go forward in a musical body gesture, you can do, but then as soon as you do, it's laughable. And if you do the typical trill, which is expected besides tremolo to be the way to crescendo intentionally and give energy and life to a given note. But it's an artifice. And so therefore, if it was acceptable in Busoni's time, in Liszt's time, to play what they call paraphrases, so a creative recreation on the piano of something else, would it be an aria of an opera, a requiem by some composer, and you want to champion the music of, which is not written specifically for the keyboard, obviously. And in this case, you appropriate yourself not only the interpretation, but in a way you choose what to bring, because you cannot play everything in an orchestral score's multi-layering. And then comes the interpretational choice. And so the interpretation, the improvisation, and the composition seem to be a little bit in a blur in between for their borders in the acceptance of it by the musical, cultural establishment, if you want, through competitions, schools, publications, recordings, contributing to freeze the music of the past within its own recitation purpose. And I think if you find the recitation of the piece limiting, then you shouldn't be playing the piece. Obviously, if you find that you're fulfilled as an artist, as a mankind representative who wants to bring to other mankind representatives a piece of art from a certain past, which is within the present when you bring it to them. There is sort of like a rupture of time sequence. All of a sudden, you are wherever that time period or that context of composing the piece brings you back to in your daydream, both for the listener and both for the reader, for the listener and the reader, is because I think always on the fact that the book is read by the other half of the author, which is the reader. And in a way, I think the audience member, informed or uninformed, receives and perceives the music played for what it is, and not only for what they know it should be. Because if they do know what it should be, then they'll be critical, because never match their desired choice of what they think is right. And then those who don't know the piece or the composer's musical language universe, they'll receive it or reject it based on their own non-musical capacities of connecting it to the psychology of what they perceive this music means to them, anguish, hopes, happiness, sadness, and more. It's more subtle than that, obviously, in the nuancing of the perception a piece emotionally received can create or trigger inside ourselves, regardless if we are knowledgeable in the field or not. I guess we're more critical when you're knowledgeable in the field than when you're not. But in a way, it's nice to not be always knowledgeable, because you should also like to be like a little child waiting to hear a storytelling to fall asleep. And I think then they go in their own daydreams, well, night dreams obviously, or afternoon nap dreams. In other words, there's always this kind of alternative reality, as Schumann used to speak about E.T.A. Hoffman's novels that fascinated him, combining fiction, daydream with the reality of the action, to the point to which the two are confusingly and purposely so ambiguously, confusingly intertwined. And so if you play the beginning of the Schumann fantasy, we know he wrote this. What if we didn't? Then we will do... is one option. I just made it, of course, on the spot, and as soon as I was making it, I realized, my God, that sounds banal. So the self-judgment is the problem, the worst problem for interpretation, because we always think, at least most of us should think, those who are not only full of themselves, though it has to do something with self-esteem, which is a form of me first, or me most, survival perhaps for the species, but necessary identification, because that's how you exist. If not, you dilute yourself. But of course you dilute your mind within the composer's mind, and as soon as you play something that is not written, because you know it's not, or you know people who will hear you know it's not, you cannot dwell in this situation without becoming highly critiqued, either for the very idea, the like adultery, as they say, by a thought, as much as by committing it, for those who try to put intention at the level of criminalization. And of course, as a teacher, I have to give the ethics to the student to observe everything there is in the score. And my teacher told me, if you really don't like it, or you don't feel like you are convinced or convincing when you perform it the way it's written, or at least the way we understand it's supposed to be, then write your own piece from the scratch. Now, it could be in the style or not of what you liked to have been done by the composer whom you serve with love, but feel like, oh, I would have wished he finished on a downbeat. I would have wished he finished, for instance, the Schumann fantasy. First movement, Schumann quotes a Beethoven song on the Ferne Geliebte, the immortal beloved or more distant beloved. So, at the end of the third movement, of that same fantasy, we are told that we are supposed to requote the ending of the first movement, which quotes that Beethoven song, already arranged by Schumann without voice. But if you want to combine it with the arpeggios, you get shot by reviews, you get shot by critiques, you get shot by, so to say, image-wise shot. You're dismissed by the world of interpretation people for being disrespectful. Because you combine two things, which are the arpeggios of the third movement and the coda of the first movement, instead of just recording it textually. Well, I think that it's debatable. So is it a question of do it if you can, or even if you could, you should not? Study towards it or keep away from it as a temptation not to fall into? Or is your rapport to the music only through the text of others? It's nothing wrong with it, but as soon as you appropriate yourself a text from another, it becomes your text. Beyond her text. It's a cheesy play on words. But it is true that during the time frame that you perform, it is your text. And it has to be believably so for the audience. In their own time, they only played music of their time, at least mostly. Today we play mostly music of other times and a little bit of ours. And ours being beyond the tonal system breaking, which happened at the beginning of the 20th century for some or many composers. It went like a powder spread. There's no more common language. Every composer comes up with their own alphabet, grammar, sounds. And so in order to be able to read a love poem in Sanskrit, you have to learn Sanskrit. And if you read it in a translation, then it's the interpretation that makes you understand one way or the other the innuendos. But then that is also the choice of the translator. But if you can learn the language, which takes lifetimes, then you can enter in some kind of sense of truth. Because you understand that some words mean something else or are not meant to even explain what else they mean. And so there's innuendos, there is sound musical choice of a word in a given language, resonance, pitch, voice. It's all part of the incarnation of the thoughts. And I think that when we play different musical styles, it's exactly implementing that, except that in the past, the styles were different from a composer to another, at least from most composers to another, while there were always those who sounded more like each other in terms of the stylistic dressing of their musical thoughts. But basically they played music of their time, which they didn't choose. And they didn't think so much out of the box because there was an urgency to live and create and earn and survive, basically. So I think it's a big luxury to be able to spend time to think, study, learn in detail, in a niche, in the depth of how to decipher the old music or ancient notation style and how to bring it to today. So this kind of archaeological, artistic approach, ethnomusicological perhaps even, I mean any kind of curiosity that brings you to appropriate for yourself and to share with others what you have perceived to be a revealed truth or a revealed beauty or a revealed meaning. And so to belittle all that to the level of what they call a copying or imitation, I think it's possible, but I think it's unfair. Because in a way we are all imitation of each other. We're like, all mankind is a theme and variations on a theme. That we like to believe it or not. For those who are racists, obviously not. But for most of us, we have to accept that. The music resembles each other, and sometimes it's done intentionally, or sometimes it's done with an obvious learning skill, how to absorb not only the notes that you recite from the score, but then absorb how they're organized through the toolbox, as I like to call it, from which you can sort of develop and make another piece that might sound in the same atmosphere, and you only put the value in it as the value that you wish to put in it. And so it becomes a necessity rather than an imitation. And you say, oh, it reminds me of that, but it's not really that. It goes somewhere else once it develops, and it's so true. If I want to start something like a fugue, I start with this, then I'll do in the answer in the dominant, and then I'll add a third voice, contrasubject, and I will learn all this this and I will apply it. Just like writing crossword puzzles in order to enjoy continuing to solve them because you can write them. But not everybody has to write the crossword puzzles. They enjoy just deciphering them and making them because it makes their brain work, travel, imagine, trigger curiosity and memory and knowledge and history and so many things. That's why I think is necessarily, in my understanding as a teacher, a healthy though measured creative tool to say to a student, I think you're allowed to add this and that there, beyond the cadenza space where traditionally we're supposed to do in a concerto, for instance, but even within a piece. And what does it bring to the student? The sense of lack of discipline, therefore criminal type of teaching because you don't give structures, which the student eventually one day will trespass, but you have to give them first. Therefore, you have to maintain the integrity of what the composer's thought was to what we understand from it, again, through the written text and the analytical understanding, as well as the interpretational examples that are plethora with easy access nowadays to media. And then you can forge your own impression, and you can find semblances between resemblance. Something reminds you of something else that was not meant to be, like when Mozart writes in the C minor sonata in A flat major B section of the slow movement, what Beethoven writes in the second movement of his Pathétique. Okay, this kind of iconic example is easy to present because the similarity is so obvious. But who's going to accuse Beethoven of plagiarism, since he is the universal genius for all of us, except to accept that we all have influences, that we quote them subconsciously or consciously, or that we like to come from somewhere in order to go somewhere, while we become a little bit of what we are. And perhaps because we deal with so many different styles, periods, today compared to the past, we try to define them not to get in trouble in terms of stylistic misunderstanding. But then is sometimes when you compose yourself, it is no more connected to interpretation through improvisation or imitation of a style, a complete work by your own. Even so, you think it's not related to any other, perhaps subconsciously or even willingly, they will be able to find some similarity. As soon as you play something, somebody will say it reminds me of this or that other piece. And in a way to define it, they have to compare it and say, oh, I know to what it reminds me of. So what? You look like your uncle instead of looking like your, I don't know, your grandpa. And that is a genetic lottery. But there is a genetic connection, so I could say that if we only played music of Mozart's time, then we wouldn't worry about harmonizing it. Because then obviously becomes some kind of a cross-breeding between styles. So the neo this, the post that, classical, romantic, whatever way you want to define it, it's the echo of something that distantly rebounds through you like a ping pong ball. And all of a sudden you find yourself in another piece. But I still think that responsibly teaching is to open the minds of the student, not to lock it with the score and say, naturally this was before us as a text that will be here after us for next generations to serve it and wonder how to serve it best. And therefore, for us to serve it best is not to rewrite it or develop it or blossom it or even customize it. Is to play it to what we think is what the composer wanted, and therefore teach it like that and transmit a tradition of how to play a rubato in Chopin, which is an unwritten interpretation. The more you sway on a certain beats, but if you go intonation. And you can do that in your practice room, and you should do that in your practice room. And when you play the piece in the performance presentation, whichever finality of it is, exam, concert, jury, job seeking, perhaps just for the sake of competing with somebody else or others, then everybody tries in classical, as they call it, music, to play what's written. And if you do something improvisatory, free, even variations on a theme, it has to be jazz. Because then you work on a chart of chords. They're not also simple, but in this case, just very simply the several of fifths in root positions. And then but of course that sounds even more banal, because it reminds you so many other pieces based on circle of fifths in the harmonic structure progression of their skeleton. And his dressing, or the charm of their personality, is what type of chords you use. If you use complex ninth chords, or you just use triads, and then how kind of the melody unveils differently with leaps and jumps. So there is customization, but it all sounds very generic. It's like, oh my God, I've heard that thousands of times. And then it appears to you in a Haydn symphony, in a Mozart opera, or in a Rachmaninoff prelude, and you go, oh, how beautiful! But you don't say, oh my God, they also use the circle of fifths. So that's not exactly creative when Ravel writes in Le Tombeau de Couperin. He does a circle of fifths with alteration instead of. He does, or one of the 2 degrees of the circle of fifth, every second degree is altered, and so you have the sense that you hear something that you've heard, but slightly not the same. And you can see that even the greatest composers use mostly vehicles to go through sections. The bridge that brings to the next thematic material. And then there's the genius of the melodic line, and you go, my God, I can never write more beautiful than Chopin melodic line. And then if you do, ashamed of myself, because it's combining sublime with ridiculous as soon as I start my own music in it. But let's say I don't improvise a second ending of the original melodic opening, that would be other than his. Then I can, and I should, write something that is entirely mine. Let's say, oh, but it reminds me of Chopin. Or it reminds me of Brahms if I do with the sixths, or Fauré with a plagal cadence. But then the toolbox helps to hint the stylistic imitation, but in the essence, in the soul of it, no. I think what matters is what you say in the substance, in the soul, regardless if it's dressed in an imitation of somebody else's, or if you think that you're inventing something that nobody ever wrote. And the lost in space or identified in a time place are 2, I think, extreme options for the way music evolves, and mostly connects to the all of the mortals that we are, through the psychological emotion that the piece brings us, that we decode so regardless if we know that is or not a tonal system with alterations or annihilation. It's like, okay, it's an atonal, and you can connect emotionally to atonal too. I don't say that, not. But I'm saying that ultimately music is not only a language beyond, it's sort of the soundtrack of our souls. And this, because as much as we try to put words on it, especially when we teach, I think we realize that everything we do belittles the thought of the composer, the words to describe it, the way of playing it, and we keep striving through our lives, hoping that at some point in our life, since we are aware of greatness of the work, from the detail to its majestic universal meaning, I hope to play well one day this and that piece. Because you realize that you're an ant at the you're an ant at the my pronunciation, at the foot of a statue, and you realize how great the statue is, but you cannot really grasp it. But you realize that it's beyond your grasp. So that creates a little bit of interior head spinning, because you feel like, oh my God, how will I serve this piece? How will I open 101? I want more melody. I want to push more on the eighth notes because they are the vehicle that brings the next quarter. And then, no, I don't think so. I did that usually earlier, but now, like 7 years later, to only bring out the arrival points. And then ultimately, why not play them all even, as if they were written even, but in fact rhythmically long and short as written. And then what about the secondary voice? If it's too obvious, then it's no more secondary, and if it's a dialogue, then it's no more an aria. And if it's a quartet, the secondary voice of the right hand, which would be a second violin under the first, decoratively being in thirds. Obviously, if you play that second violin part, you will only think, and next to you somebody sings, and to the other side next to you somebody drops dramatically, and on the bottom somebody holds the dominant pedal, which are suspended in the expectation of a tonic. But it doesn't happen but much later in the piece, so it keeps you in an expectation. So yes, you can say to yourself, I also would like to write something like this because I love it so much in Beethoven, but I don't want to appear to imitate Beethoven. Besides, who am I and why should I? And everybody will tell me it's useless. And therefore I should just focus on playing the best what is there because it fulfills me. And that I think is perfectly beautiful as an aesthetic and honest statement. And as Mlle Boulanger said to me, that some composers didn't need to contest the tonal system they received in order to express the novelties that they have inside them compared to the music of before. Well, same thing for the interpretation. For some performers, the necessity is to try to perform at best over and over through a lifetime devoted to serve the muse, to play these pieces at their best, what you consider the best. And despite of the fact that you win or not a competition, that the jury or the audience is standing up and saying bravo and feels connected with your interpretation, you might still think, that's not how I really wanted to play it. Tempo, articulation, meaning, mood, or rubato, and listen to a recording of it, even not right away, with time passing, and you feel like, I thought I played very well or close to what I wanted to do. But no, in fact, when you hear it with an objective point of view, with time passed, without playing it, then you realize, next time I'll try to do more of this, or I'll try to explore more of that, because it really means to me more, the structure, or the rhythm, or the melodic line, or the pedaling, or all of these together, but in a proportion that creates what is your musical universe through the piece you receive, which you transmit to the audience. And then that quest of never-ending best interpretation in your eyes or ears or mind is what drives you through life. And I think it's beautiful, meaningful, essential, and it makes on the way happy people around you because they receive it through your funnel or your passionate conviction. And I think that even in the eyes of a professional who knows, who can say, it's the wrong conviction, I cannot say it's wrong to play this hasted because I think is a longing for love. The first ballad by Chopin with the retarded chord progressions that come after the melody is exposed alone. So you can say the sentence like this, or you can say the sentence like that, or you can say the sentence like that. At that point you bring differently elements, consciously or not, possibly not always consciously, which so mean to you that right on for the tension it builds and the resolution that it necessitates. But it could also be monologue of mine today with you all and each is that I think we should allow ourselves to live, when we serve the muse, with a healthy dose of freedom based on the way we love the piece. If you love it, you cannot betray it. You could betray it by loving it the wrong way according to the rules and the establishment, but it's necessary that you find some kind of meaning and place of yourself in the way the piece reveals itself through you to the audience or to the people you target to bring it to. You can also choose just to be for you and not care about what the others listen of it, and you just write your own ballades for yourself, or you improvise your own preludes, and even if they remind you of beloved authors, then you just say, oh, I wish this author had written a book about that, so because you know so well the vocabulary universe of this author, you can almost do that. And it's not less valuable. It's in the eyes of the beholder, really, always, what is valuable or not. But I still think that if you give the tools of, I like to call the boundaries, you unbound. And in a way, you're even more connected and belonging to the piece when you're not bound to it. It's almost like a magnetic attraction to the musical meaning of the piece, regardless if you understand it correctly in the eyes of a professional or of a competitor. It's what it means to you. And therefore, if at some point you dare, and that's the word that really, I think, corresponds well to this idea of composing through developing from the imitation of another style. It's almost like labor of love. In fact, the problem is that now that we have so many styles that we study, know, learn, and like, love, perhaps more some than others, because not always identifying fully with each, in terms of revisitations from our point of view for their, what is the meaning of what they wanted to say to us through that, to each other, to themselves, to mankind. It always sounds cheesy all of a sudden when I speak in general, universal terms, but I think it's to do with the individual and your own relation with that universal beauty. So I don't think it's possible to always stay in the same style. You can start like Mozart and switch to Brahms. And people would say, oh my god, this reminds me of the Brahms concerto. Everything reminds me of something. Oh, I'm getting entangled in my own presentation intellectually. Yeah. Thank you.